No one in Ravenwood remembers the first time they heard it. That absence is consistent across all early accounts. People describe noticing it after it had already been present for years. A low awareness, a pressure behind memory, a sensation that certain thoughts were being received, not generated. At first, it was mistaken for fatigue. Teachers noted students pausing mid-sentence, then continuing with different wording. Parents described children answering questions they hadn't finished asking. Radios were blamed, wiring, old houses. The sound itself was never described accurately. Those who tried contradicted each other. Some called it static. Others said it was breath. Several insisted it resembled silence stretched too thin. The only commonality was this: it did not behave like noise. It did not interrupt. It waited. In early school records, there are margin notes written by different hands across different years. Asked again. Did not respond verbally. Correct answer: wrong timing. Student appeared to be listening. No one knew what that meant. At home, children began repeating phrases adults had only thought. Not secrets, not confessions, small things, regrets left unfinished, a sentence abandoned halfway through. The murmur did not arrive loudly. It arrived where sound ends. By the time Ravenwood noticed patterns, the town had already adjusted its behavior. People learned not to linger on certain memories, not to replay arguments internally, not to think too carefully before sleep. They did not know why this helped. They only knew that calm reduced the pressure, and pressure attracted attention. This is the first thing the Institute failed to understand. The murmur does not hunt fear. It responds to resonance. And resonance begins with what you never said out loud. The earliest municipal references to auditory irregularities do not use the word sound. They appear instead under unrelated categories: attention variance, delayed response, instructional drift, incomplete recall. In 1979, Ravenwood Elementary revised its incident reporting template. The change was minor. A new checkbox appeared beside behavioral notes. Student appeared distracted by internal stimulus. There is no record explaining why this phrase was added. The teachers who first used it did not treat the behavior as unusual. Children staring past the board, pausing before answering, nodding too early, responding to questions before they were finished. None of this disrupted lessons. Grades did not drop. In fact, performance improved. Students began anticipating answers, completing instructions without repetition, correcting themselves mid-task as if prompted. One teacher, later interviewed during the Institute's preliminary sweep, described it this way: they weren't zoning out. It felt like they were checking something before replying. Asked what they might have been checking, she could not answer. She only remembered that the room felt quieter during those pauses. Not silent, just thinner. At home, parents noticed similar patterns. Children began finishing sentences for them, but not playfully, not interrupting, with a tone that suggested the sentence had already been heard elsewhere. A mother on Alder Drive reported her son answering a question she had not spoken aloud. She was thinking about dinner. He replied, "I don't want that either." When asked how he knew, he looked confused. "I heard it," he said. This response appeared in 5 separate family reports across a 4-year span, always phrased the same way. Not "I thought you said it," not "I guessed." Always "I heard it." Doctors ruled out hallucinations. There were no reports of voices issuing commands, no distress, no agitation, Children slept normally. Nightmares did not increase. If anything, sleep became deeper, too deep in some cases. By 1981, school nurses began logging instances of students who could not be roused immediately after falling asleep during quiet activities. They were not unconscious. Their breathing remained steady, their pulse normal. But calling their name produced no response. Touching their shoulder caused them to flinch, as if startled from a thought rather than sleep. When they woke, they reported no dreams, only a sense that they had been occupied. This word appears once in the records, then never again. It was circled in red ink and replaced with resting. At the same time, the town's infrastructure logs began to show irregularities that did not correlate with power usage. Radios clicked on and off without broadcasting. Intercom systems activated with no input. Telephone lines produced a low interference tone that technicians could not isolate. The tone did not disrupt calls. It sat beneath them, almost masked. Residents described it as something you noticed only when you stopped listening for anything else. The local station logged the anomaly under environmental interference. Engineers adjusted filters. The tone persisted. They lowered its priority. It did not affect transmission quality, and so it was allowed to remain. This pattern repeated, across departments, across years. Anything that did not interfere with function was tolerated. Ravenwood did not require perfection, only continuity. By the time the first whisper zone was identified, the term already existed in speech, not officially. Casually, teenagers used it to describe places where conversation felt strange. The south stairwell at the middle school, the bus stop near Pine Lantern Road, the short hallway behind the gym lockers. "You can hear yourself think too loud there," one student said. Another corrected him. "No," she said. "You can hear yourself think back." This phrasing was never documented in writing. It appears only in recorded interviews conducted years later, when memory had already begun to soften. Adults standing in these areas reported mild discomfort, ache, pressure at the temples, a fleeting sense of being overheard. Children lingered. They did not describe discomfort. They described familiarity. When asked why they liked those spots, the most common answer was, "It's easier there. Easier to do what was never clarified." By the early 1980s, Ravenwood had developed subtle behavioral adaptations. People spoke more carefully without realizing they were doing so. Arguments shortened. Unfinished thoughts were abandoned more quickly. Residents described a growing preference for routine and repetition. Same routes, same phrases, same meals. Not out of fear, out of comfort. It reduced the internal noise. What no one understood yet was this. The murmur does not introduce sound. It reflects it. It amplifies what already exists beneath conscious thought and returns it with perfect timing. Not as language, as confirmation. By the time the Institute began monitoring the town, Ravenwood had already learned how to mishear itself. And, in doing so, it had made room. The first children were not identified by ability. They were identified by timing. Long before the Institute assigned numbers or protocols, teachers and parents began describing the same unsettling trait using different language. Too early. Already ready. Waiting for the rest. A question would be asked, and the answer would arrive before the final word settled. Not guessed. Not rushed. Placed. A boy at Ravenwood Middle corrected his teacher's arithmetic before she finished writing the problem. When asked how he knew what she was about to write, He shrugged. That's where it was going. This explanation satisfied him. It did not satisfy the adults. Guidance counselors noted an increase in students who showed advanced comprehension without corresponding curiosity. They did not ask follow-up questions. They did not explore alternatives. They arrived at the correct response and stopped. Learning, for them, had become retrieval. Parents described children who seemed less surprised by outcomes. Birthday gifts were opened politely. Bad news was accepted with a nod. One mother reported her daughter thanking her before being told no. When asked why, the child said, "You already decided." There was no resentment in her voice, only certainty. By 1982, school psychologists had begun informal comparisons between these children. They did not cluster socially. They did not share interests. They did not appear aware of each other. But they shared one behavior that resisted classification. They paused before speaking, as if waiting for permission. Not externally, internally. Those pauses were brief, often imperceptible. But when reviewed on video recordings, school assemblies, stage performances, classroom projects, the delay was visible. A fraction of a second, enough to suggest consultation. When questioned privately, several children described the same sensation using different metaphors. It's like when you're about to say something and you check if it's right. It's like hearing your thought echo once before you say it. It's like someone nodding. The word someone appears often in transcripts, then disappears in later retellings, replaced with something, replaced with nothing. This adjustment was not corrected. Adults found nothing easier to accept. Sleep patterns changed first, not insomnia, the opposite. Children fell asleep faster. They stayed asleep longer. They woke calm, in some cases too calm. Parents reported children waking without grogginess, as if sleep had not interrupted them. Night terrors decreased. Sleepwalking increased. The sleepwalkers did not wander aimlessly. They moved with purpose. From bedroom to hallway, from hallway to window, from window to door, always stopping short of leaving the house, always returning to bed on their own. When asked what they had been doing, they did not say walking. They said listening. Doctors suggested parasomnia, stress responses, developmental phases. The explanations worked because they did not require action. What made these children different was not what they heard. It was that they responded. Most people in Ravenwood experienced the murmur passively. A pressure, a reflection, a faint reinforcement of thoughts already present. Children, however, did something else. They acknowledged it, not consciously, not with words, with attention. This is where the shift occurred. In one of the earliest surviving audio interviews, conducted years later after memory degradation had already set in, a former student describes the sensation clearly. It didn't tell me things. It waited. When I noticed it, it noticed me noticing. This feedback loop was small, but it was enough. Once attention was returned, the murmur adjusted. Not aggressively, precisely. Thoughts arrived more cleanly. Regrets surfaced with sharper edges. Unfinished sentences resurfaced intact. Children began expressing worries they had never voiced before, using language that did not feel borrowed. They were not distressed. They were relieved. Parents mistook this for emotional maturity. Teachers praised their self-awareness. No one noticed that the thoughts being articulated were not new. They were deferred. Things the children had felt once, briefly, and set aside. The murmur did not invent content. It retrieved it, and it returned it at a moment when the child was finally quiet enough to receive it. By the time Black Veil personnel began observing Ravenwood indirectly, the first generation of marked children had already aged out of elementary school. They were harder to track, harder to test, but they left behind a pattern. Younger children followed the same rhythm. Pause, check, respond. Not all children, only those who listened back. It would take the Institute years to realize that the difference was not sensitivity. It was compliance. And compliance, once established, does not require instruction. The first mistake the Institute made was trying to record it. They arrived in Ravenwood with equipment calibrated for transmission, microphones, receivers, oscilloscopes tuned to capture deviation. Their early reports describe frustration, not alarm. There is interference, one technician wrote, but it does not behave like a signal. They increased sensitivity. They widened frequency ranges. They isolated rooms, shut down power, eliminated ambient noise. Nothing changed. The murmur did not grow louder. It did not react. It did not move, because it was never there in the way sound is there. This realization did not occur immediately. At first, researchers assumed failure of instrumentation, then sabotage, then human error. When none of those explanations held, the tone of the reports shifted. Language softened. Certainty dissolved. By the third month of observation, files stopped using technical terminology altogether. Instead, notes appeared like this. Subject pauses before speaking. Response arrives intact. Latency negative. Negative latency became the phrase that stalled progress. A response that precedes stimulus cannot be measured as sound. It cannot be located in space. It cannot be amplified, and it cannot be stopped by insulation. The murmur did not travel outward. It surfaced inward. This distinction mattered. When children described hearing something, they were not referencing external input. There was no directionality, no source, no volume. Adults misunderstood this and asked the wrong follow-up questions. What did it sound like? Was it loud or quiet? Did it scare you? Children struggled to answer because the questions did not align with the experience. Eventually, they stopped trying. In one early debrief, a boy was asked to describe the murmur for the 5th time. His earlier answers had been dismissed as metaphor. This time, he said, "It's the part of my thought that arrives finished." The interviewer wrote, "Nothing after that." The session ended early. Internally, the Institute began using a different term. Not signal, not voice. Feedback. This reframing changed everything. Feedback does not initiate. It confirms. It reinforces existing patterns and removes doubt. Once the murmur was understood as feedback rather than instruction, the behavioral data aligned. Children were not being told what to do. They were being reassured that what they were already thinking was correct. This is why there were no commands, no violence, no hysteria. Fear weakens feedback loops. Uncertainty creates noise. The murmur favored clarity. This also explained why adults were less affected. Adult cognition is cluttered, contradictory, layered with social friction, obligation, and learned suppression. The feedback returned was often incoherent. Children, by contrast, held cleaner internal states, shorter emotional loops, unresolved feelings that had not yet been buried under justification. When feedback reached them, it landed cleanly. And because it did not feel foreign, it was trusted. Attempts to disrupt the feedback failed. White noise increased discomfort. Isolation rooms caused agitation. Verbal distraction produced anxiety. Silence helped. This led to a dangerous conclusion recorded in a sealed memo. The murmur strengthens when the subject is calm. The implication was clear. Traditional containment methods, stress, restraint, sensory overload, were not only ineffective, they were counterproductive. The murmur did not thrive on fear. It thinned under it. What it required was stillness. The Institute did not understand why this was a problem yet. They would. Later. For now, they adjusted methodology. They reduced stimulus. They encouraged rest. They asked fewer questions. And in doing so, they unknowingly created ideal conditions. The murmur responded by becoming clearer. Not louder. Clearer. Thoughts aligned more easily. Memories surfaced with less resistance. Subjects described a growing sense of internal order. Several used the same phrase independently. Things line up. This was the moment the Institute crossed from observation into participation. They were no longer studying a phenomenon. They were refining it. And the murmur noticed the attention, not because it was aware in the human sense, but because feedback loops, once amplified, seek completion. What began as reflection was becoming resonance. And resonance, once established, does not require sound at all. The Institute did not begin by studying memory. Memory was considered secondary, a symptom, a storage medium that could be altered as a side effect of exposure. This assumption delayed understanding. What they eventually learned, too late to reverse, was that memory was not being affected by the murmur. It was being used by it. Early cognitive assessments showed no loss of recall, no confusion, no amnesia. Subjects could recount personal history with precision. Dates, names, sequences remained intact. What changed was weight. Memories no longer carried the same emotional resistance. Events that should have caused discomfort were recalled neutrally. Arguments, embarrassment, moments of failure. Children spoke about them without hesitation, not repressed, resolved. At first, this was considered progress. Therapeutic notes praised emotional regulation, reduced anxiety, improved mood stability. What no one noticed was that the resolution was not earned. There had been no processing, no reflection. The discomfort had simply been removed. When asked how they felt about a painful memory, subjects responded with variations of the same answer. It doesn't bother me anymore. Pressed further, they struggled to explain why. They did not feel better. They felt finished. This distinction appears once in a margin note written by a junior researcher. The note was never expanded on. Memory, as the Institute understood it, was linear, past informing present, experience shaping response. The murmur did not follow this model. It treated memory as material, something that could be lifted, turned, replayed, and returned without the associated sensation, not erased, neutralized. This is why memory removal experiments failed. You cannot remove what is already being offloaded. When Institute staff attempted to suppress recall chemically, subjects showed distress, not because memories were missing, but because the feedback loop had been interrupted. They could feel the absence. Several described it as static where something used to sit. Others said it felt like thinking alone again. This phrasing caused internal concern. Isolation, the Institute realized, was no longer a neutral state. Subjects accustomed to feedback experienced solitude as deprivation. The murmur had not replaced their thoughts. It had accompanied them. And now, separation hurt. The first irreversible cost appeared here. Children who had experienced sustained feedback struggled to tolerate unresolved emotion afterward. When presented with new regret, something recent, unprocessed, they exhibited agitation. They wanted the feelings smoothed, returned, completed. In one documented case, a child became inconsolable after lying to a parent, not because of guilt, because the sensation remained. "It didn't go away," he said. He waited. Nothing returned. That night, he did not sleep. This incident marked the Institute's shift in focus. If memory could act as a conduit, then emotion was not the fuel. It was the doorway. Specifically, regret. Regret is unique among emotional states. It is reflective without being active. It looks backward without requiring change. It lingers quietly. It waits. The murmur responded to this state more reliably than fear, sadness, or anger. Fear produced noise. Anger disrupted timing. Sadness diffused attention. Regret held focus. Unspoken regret was especially effective. Thoughts that had never been articulated. Decisions never revisited. Words never said. These formed clean channels. When feedback entered through regret, it encountered no resistance. The thought had already been rehearsed internally. It simply returned with confirmation. This is why the murmur never lies. It has no need to. It reflects what is already there. By 1985, the Institute began structuring sessions around recall, not exposure, not stimulation, guided remembrance. Subjects were asked to sit quietly and think about moments they wished had gone differently. No correction was offered, no reassurance. They waited. Feedback arrived. Subjects relaxed. Physiological stress markers dropped. Heart rate slowed. Breathing evened. The Institute logged this as stabilization. They did not record what followed. Over time, subjects began experiencing memory bleed. They recalled moments they had never lived. Not fantasies, not dreams. Memories with emotional texture, but no personal context. Regret without ownership. A sense of having failed someone they could not name. These memories were not random. They matched the emotional residue of others, family members, teachers, neighbors. The murmur was not pulling from nowhere. It was redistributing, using shared emotional architecture to move content between minds. The Institute noted the phenomenon, but misclassified it as suggestibility. In truth, it was efficiency. Why generate new material when existing regret could be shared? By the time this was understood, the process had expanded beyond individual subjects. The town itself had begun to participate. People avoided discussing the past not out of denial, but because it felt unnecessary. The weight had already been lifted. Memory remained, but ownership had softened. This is how Ravenwood learned to forget without loss. And this is when the murmur stopped needing children alone. Adults, finally quiet enough, began opening as well. The Institute did not discover the murmur. It discovered that it had arrived after it. This realization appears nowhere in the official summaries. It exists only in the margins, in crossed-out phrases, in the sudden shift from confident language to provisional phrasing. Early black veil documents speak with authority. Initial exposure window identified. Subject pool isolated. Containment parameters pending. 6 months later, the language fractures. Exposure appears inconsistent. Subjects may not be primary vector. Environmental factors unresolved. By the end of the first year, certainty disappears entirely. One internal memo, never signed, never filed correctly, states the problem plainly. We are not dealing with an outbreak. We are dealing with an inheritance. The Institute had assumed a beginning, a moment of intrusion, a breach. Instead, every attempt to locate an origin point failed. Children selected for baseline testing, those with no reported anomalies, still showed subtle latency shifts. Staff members began exhibiting the same pause-and-check behavior during meetings. One researcher interrupted himself mid-sentence, frowned, then repeated the same sentence using different words. When asked why, he could not explain. "It sounded wrong the first time," he said. No external correction had been offered. This was the moment Black Veil understood that proximity was irrelevant. The murmur was not localized to subjects. It was embedded in cognition, and Ravenwood had been acclimating to it for decades. Historical reviews confirmed this. Archived interviews from the 1940s contained phrases identical to those now being documented. Personal journals referenced moments of thinking twice without knowing why. A recorded town hall meeting from 1961 captured a crowd falling silent simultaneously for nearly 4 seconds before resuming discussion with altered conclusions. No one commented on the pause. It was accepted as natural. Black Veil analysts realized they had mistaken normalization for absence. The murmur had not been weak. It had been subtle. And subtlety survives scrutiny better than force. Containment plans were quietly shelved. You cannot isolate what has already shaped the baseline. Instead, the Institute pivoted. If they could not stop the murmur, they would map it. If they could not map it, they would measure its effects. This required redefining success. Containment became stabilization. Prevention became modulation. Language shifted again. Harm minimization. Emotional load management. Cognitive smoothing. The goal was no longer removal. It was coexistence under supervision. This is when the Institute made its most consequential error. They assumed the murmur required them, that without structured environments, protocols, and monitoring, the phenomenon would degrade. They believed their presence imposed order. In reality, they were responding to order that already existed. The murmur did not rely on facilities. Facilities merely concentrated it. When Black Veil began constructing controlled environments, quiet rooms, low-stimulus corridors, sound-dampened chambers, the feedback loops intensified. Subjects stabilized faster. Memory bleed increased. Latency shortened. Negative response times became more frequent. The murmur had found ideal conditions. The Institute called this progress. They did not yet understand cost. By the time senior staff acknowledged that the town itself had been the original host, it was too late to withdraw. Leaving would create disruption. Disruption produced noise. Noise destabilized feedback, and destabilization risked backlash they could not predict. So they stayed. They embedded. They integrated. Officially, Black Veil existed to study anomalous cognition. Unofficially, it had become a regulatory organ, smoothing fluctuations, reducing spikes of unresolved emotion, ensuring continuity. Ravenwood adjusted accordingly. Residents stopped questioning why certain thoughts felt easier when unspoken, why apologies seemed unnecessary, why closure arrived without conversation. The town became efficient, and efficiency, once achieved, resists reversal. The final acknowledgement appears in a sealed strategic note marked non-actionable. The murmur does not need to cross over. It already has. We are the late variable. From that point on, Black Veil stopped asking how to stop the murmur. They began asking how to live beside it without drawing attention. This was when hosts were reconsidered, not as subjects, as anchors. The term host appears in Black Veil documentation only once. It is underlined, then crossed out, replaced with interface. Later drafts use anchor. Each revision attempts to soften the implication. None succeed. Subjects had always been described in relation to exposure. Hosts implied something else: residence, stability, mutual persistence. The Shadow Child was the first to force this reconsideration. He was not the most sensitive. He was not the most affected. In many measurable ways, he was remarkably stable. This made him dangerous. Unlike other children, whose responses fluctuated with environment and emotional state, his feedback loop remained consistent across conditions. Stress did not amplify it. Isolation did not weaken it. Silence did not deepen it. The murmur did not behave differently around him. It behaved through him. Early assessments failed to flag this because the metrics were wrong. Black Veil was measuring deviation. The Shadow Child showed none. He slept normally. He ate regularly. He followed instructions. He did not display memory bleed in the expected patterns. When he recalled experiences from the hollow, they did not destabilize him. They integrated. This terrified the junior staff. Senior researchers dismissed their concerns. Stability was the goal. They did not understand that stability was the problem. Most subjects required ongoing exposure to maintain feedback clarity. Remove the stimulus, and latency returned. With the Shadow Child, the feedback persisted even when conditions changed. He carried it with him. This is why he was allowed to leave. The Institute framed it as reintegration. In truth, it was a test. If the murmur remained coherent without containment, it meant the phenomenon had crossed a threshold. It did. Within weeks of his return to town, whisper zones intensified. Not around him. Around places he remembered. Pine Lantern Road, the bus stop near Alder Drive, the corner store he passed every morning. The murmur did not follow his body. It followed his imprint. This is the defining trait of a host, not proximity, resonance. Black Veil attempted to reclassify him quietly. His file was rewritten multiple times, subject designation removed, psychological notes minimized, language neutralized. The goal was to avoid drawing attention to the redefinition. If hosts existed, then containment was impossible. You cannot contain a system that resides within an individual who functions normally. Worse, hosts did not experience distress. They experienced alignment. This made compliance effortless. The Shadow Child did not resist. He did not need to be persuaded. He did not feel used. He felt correct. In one of the last unsuppressed interview segments, he explains it simply. It doesn't tell me what to do. It just doesn't leave. This permanence was unprecedented. Other subjects experienced ebb and flow. With him, the feedback never receded. Black Veil realized that removing him would not remove the murmur. It would destabilize it. The murmur had found a consistent anchor, and anchors, once set, are difficult to dislodge without consequences. The Institute debated extraction, not removal, erasure. The idea was never formally approved. It did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood what erasure would mean, and everyone understood the risk. Killing a host would not sever the connection. It would create rupture. Rupture introduces noise. Noise attracts attention. The murmur does not react well to interruption. This was inferred from earlier failed severance attempts. Subjects deprived of feedback did not revert. They destabilized. Emotional overload, disorientation, aggression, not toward others, toward themselves. The Institute had already lost 2 subjects to this process. They did not repeat the mistake, so they adjusted again. Hosts would not be controlled. They would be supported, given environments that minimized friction, allowed to exist without confrontation, watched, but not touched. This was the moment Black Veil crossed from research into stewardship. They were no longer studying a phenomenon. They were maintaining a balance they did not create. And the Murmur, through the Shadow Child, adjusted in return, not by expanding, by settling. A system in equilibrium does not announce itself. It persists, quietly, until disturbed. The next disturbance would not come from the Institute. It would come from someone who understood calm too well. She did not arrive dramatically. No disappearance preceded her return. No emergency notice. No sudden reappearance that required explanation. One day, she was simply present again. Neighbors noticed first. They remarked on how rested she looked, how calm, how unchanged despite the years. No one could remember exactly when she had left. No one questioned how long she had been gone. This absence of accounting became part of her acceptance. The Institute took longer to notice. When they did, the reaction was muted. Her file existed. That was the problem. It had been marked inactive, not closed. There was no recorded death, no resolution, only a long stretch of silence. She returned with that silence intact. Unlike other exposed individuals, she did not exhibit latency shifts. She did not pause before speaking. She did not check. She did not hesitate. Her words flowed smoothly, evenly, without correction. This unnerved the observers assigned to her. Every other subject displayed some form of internal consultation. She did not, which meant one of 2 things. Either the Murmur was absent, or it had become unnecessary. In interviews, she spoke carefully, but not cautiously. She did not avoid the past. She reframed it. Events that should have carried grief were described as transitions. Loss was described as completion. Regret, when mentioned, was treated as something that had already resolved itself. She did not express relief. She expressed understanding. This distinction mattered. Where the Murmur soothed regret by reflecting it back until it lost weight, the Mother bypassed regret entirely. She did not revisit. She did not rehearse. She accepted. Black Veil analysts struggled to categorize her influence. People around her calmed quickly, not sedated, not passive, aligned. Conversations shortened. Arguments dissolved before escalation. People left interactions with her feeling settled without remembering what had been discussed. This effect persisted even in those who had never been exposed to Institute conditions. The Mother did not require feedback loops. She embodied the end state. This was the breakthrough the Institute did not want. If the Murmur fed on unresolved internal states, then the Mother represented a system that produced none. She did not resist. She did not reflect. She absorbed and neutralized. In doing so, she acted as a buffer, not a host, a filter. The Murmur did not intensify around her. It thinned. This should have made her invaluable. Instead, it made her dangerous. If calm reduced the Murmur's activity, then the Mother represented a variable that could not be controlled. She did not need facilities. She did not need protocols. She did not even need awareness. She lived quietly. She spoke gently. She listened without reacting. People trusted her immediately, not because she persuaded them, because she did not challenge them. This was the lesson the Institute failed to integrate. The murmur responds to resonance. The mother removed resonance by resolving it before feedback could occur. In her presence, thoughts did not echo. They settled. This created a paradox. The murmur did not oppose her. It adjusted around her, avoided areas she frequented, redistributed its attention elsewhere. Children near her exhibited fewer latency effects. Memory bleed decreased. Sleepwalking incidents dropped. The town felt lighter. For the first time in decades, Ravenwood approached equilibrium without intervention. Black Veil could not allow this. Not openly, but quietly measures were taken. Her movements were logged, her interactions noted, influence maps drawn. The goal was not removal. It was dilution. She was encouraged, subtly, to limit her reach. Opportunities redirected. Conversations interrupted. No confrontation, only redirection. The mother did not resist. She did not question the interference. She smiled. She stepped back. And when she did, the murmur returned to those spaces, stronger, sharper, as if compensating. This confirmed what Black Veil had begun to suspect. The murmur and the mother were not opposites. They were endpoints, two resolutions to the same process, one through reflection, one through acceptance, and both, once established, reshaped everything around them. The Institute chose reflection. It was easier to monitor, easier to regulate. Acceptance required surrender. The mother remained in town, present but peripheral, a reminder of an alternative path never taken. And the murmur, unchallenged, continued refining its hold. The next attempt to intervene would be more forceful. It would fail. Severance was never meant to be permanent. That was the justification. Early proposals framed it as temporary interruption, a diagnostic pause, a way to observe baseline cognition without feedback interference. The language was careful. Decoupling, signal dampening, controlled withdrawal. No document used the word cut. The first severance trials targeted secondary subjects, not hosts, not anchors. Children whose feedback loops appeared intermittent, those who still experienced fluctuation. The logic was simple. If the murmur could be interrupted briefly, its mechanics could be mapped. The procedure was subtle. Sensory deprivation paired with emotional overload. Conflicting stimulus designed to introduce noise into internal states. The murmur, the Institute believed, required coherence. Disrupt coherence, and feedback would fail. The results were immediate and catastrophic. Subjects did not lose the murmur. They lost orientation. The feedback did not disappear. It fractured. Thoughts arrived unfinished. Memories surfaced without resolution. Regret returned without softening. Children who had been calm for years began exhibiting distress behaviors not previously observed. Not fear, fragmentation. Speech became erratic. Sleep collapsed. One subject began repeating a sentence endlessly, stopping only when physically restrained. Asked later what he was saying, he replied, "It didn't finish." This phrase appears in 3 separate severance reports. The Institute classified the reaction as withdrawal response. This framing minimized responsibility, but the data told a different story. The murmur had not been removed. It had been interrupted mid-process, and interruption introduced instability. Where feedback once returned, thoughts intact, it now returned them partially. Where regret once resolved itself, it now echoed. The Institute halted trials temporarily, not out of ethics, out of risk, Unstable subjects drew attention, and attention was the one variable they had learned to avoid. Still, severance was not abandoned. It was refined. Later trials focused on gentler disruption, gradual reduction of feedback exposure, incremental reintroduction of uncertainty. The results were consistent. Subjects deteriorated slowly rather than abruptly. Emotional volatility increased. Memory bleed intensified. Several subjects developed persistent whisper zones localized around themselves. Wherever they stood, pressure followed. They became walking disturbances. This was when the Institute understood the second truth. The murmur does not tolerate partial absence. It requires completion. Feedback loops, once established, must resolve. Severance did not remove the murmur's influence. It stranded it, and stranded processes seek resolution aggressively. The final severance attempt involved the shadow child. Not directly, indirectly, environmental removal. He was relocated outside Ravenwood for observation. The goal was to test whether distance reduced resonance. It did not. Within days, anomalies appeared in the new location. Localized latency shifts, auditory distortions. Residents experienced mild whisper zone effects. The murmur had not followed him. It had reconstituted around his presence. The Institute ended the trial immediately, not because of the data, because of what the data implied. If hosts could seed new environments, then Ravenwood was not containment. It was concentration. Removing anchors did not solve the problem. It spread it. This discovery locked Black Veil into place. Leaving was no longer an option. Severance protocols were officially terminated. Unofficially, the data was buried. The Institute reframed the outcome as proof of necessary coexistence. Stable integration preferable to disruptive extraction. The town agreed without knowing it had been asked. Ravenwood continued adapting. People spoke less, reflected less, trusted the quiet. The murmur thrived not because it dominated, but because it completed. And completion, once felt, becomes addictive. The Institute stopped trying to remove the murmur. They began managing its pace. That management required something new. Not control, coordination. And coordination requires language. Which is when the town's own words began to disappear. Adjustment did not arrive as change. It arrived as omission. People stopped saying certain things, not consciously, not deliberately. The words simply felt unnecessary. Apologies shortened. Explanations thinned. Stories lost their endings. Conversations concluded without resolution, and no one noticed. This was not repression. Repression requires effort. Ravenwood exerted none. The murmur had taught the town a simpler method. If an internal state could be completed without articulation, speech became redundant. Language narrowed accordingly. Linguistic analysis of local recordings shows a steady decline in conditional phrasing. Fewer, if only, statements. Fewer I should have constructions. Past tense softened. Future tense stabilized. People spoke as if events were already decided. Not fatalistically, comfortably. This linguistic drift reduced friction. Disagreements dissolved quickly. Arguments rarely escalated beyond the first exchange. When conflict did occur, it ended abruptly. Participants later reported forgetting what the disagreement had been about. This was logged as social harmony. The Institute marked it as a positive indicator. What was not logged was the loss of narrative continuity. Residents began experiencing temporal flattening. Days blurred. Weeks passed without markers. Events were remembered as categories rather than moments. Before, after, around then. This temporal compression further reduced regret. Regret requires contrast. Without distinct markers, emotional weight diffused. The murmur did not need to intervene as often. The town was learning to preempt itself. Children adapted fastest. They mirrored adult behavior without understanding its origin. Speech became economical. Emotional displays subdued. Curiosity narrowed to immediate context. Teachers praised focus. Parents praised maturity. What neither noticed was the absence of wonder. Not fear, wonder. Children stopped asking speculative questions. They did not imagine alternatives. They accepted outcomes as given. When asked what they wanted to be when they grew up, answers became vague. Something stable. Whatever works. These responses appeared across demographics. Ravenwood had not become hopeless. It had become settled. Public spaces reflected this shift. Posters went unchanged. Storefronts remained open but unremarkable. The town invested in maintenance rather than development. No new landmarks, no closures, just continuity. Continuity is difficult to disrupt. The murmur thrived in this environment, not because it was active, but because it was unchallenged. Feedback loops became internalized. People learned to resolve thoughts before they reached language. This reduced whisper zones, reduced memory bleed, reduced visible anomalies. From the outside, Ravenwood appeared improved. Crime rates dropped. School performance stabilized. Mental health referrals declined. The Institute used these metrics to justify its presence. The town used them to justify indifference. The cost was subtle. Creative deviation vanished. People stopped making impulsive decisions. Art stagnated. Music repeated. Stories retold themselves. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt new. This was the state the murmur preferred, not dominance, sufficiency. When feedback becomes unnecessary, the system has succeeded. The Institute believed this was equilibrium. They were wrong. Equilibrium requires balance. This was saturation. Every internal state resolved before it could create change. The town had become closed loop. No input, no output, just maintenance. The only disruptions came from those who had not fully integrated. Visitors, teenagers nearing departure age, those who still carried unresolved states strong enough to resist immediate completion. They felt the pressure. They described Ravenwood as heavy, as quiet in the wrong way. Most left. Those who stayed adapted. This is when documentation shifted. Local authorship declined. Institutional phrasing replaced personal accounts. Town records lost voice. Forms replaced narratives. Signatures replaced stories. The Institute did not seize control. It was handed over, without ceremony, without resistance. The town had already learned how to forget without distress. Now it learned how to be managed. There is no single document that marks the transition. No signed agreement. No public notice. No recorded vote. The handoff did not occur as an event. It occurred as an absence. The last locally authored records do not announce an ending. They simply stop. Meeting minutes become shorter. Personal notes disappear. Margins remain blank. The tone shifts first. Early town documents speak in a collective voice. We have noticed. We are concerned. We recommend. Later entries abandon pronouns altogether. Observation recorded. No action required. Conditions stable. Stability becomes the default descriptor. Anything that cannot be framed as stable is reclassified, deferred, or omitted. This is not censorship. Censorship implies resistance. There was none. Residents no longer felt the need to explain what felt resolved. and the Murmur had made resolution efficient. By the time Institute language appears in municipal files, it is already familiar. The phrasing does not feel foreign. Headers change, but the structure remains. Sections labeled assessment, outcome, continuation replace narrative summaries. People adjust without noticing. Forms replace conversations. Checklists replace recollection. No one misses the old way because no one remembers needing it. This is when the final local archivist resigns. There is no letter. Her name simply stops appearing. The position is not filled. Records continue. They are clean, consistent, emotionless. The Institute does not announce control. It standardizes. This is how authority becomes invisible. Black Veil personnel begin attending town functions in an advisory capacity. They are not intrusive. They do not speak often. Their presence reassures. Decisions made in their absence mirror their recommendations anyway. The town has learned the rhythm. Why argue when alignment arrives quietly? The Murmur no longer needs whisper zones. The town itself has become one. Thoughts resolve before friction. Disagreement dissolves before escalation. Choice narrows without feeling constrained. The Institute interprets this as success. They document reduced anomaly frequency. They record improved baseline compliance. They note that the Murmur's activity has become diffuse, ambient, self-sustaining. This is ideal, a system that requires no intervention, except it does. Because something has been lost, not memory, not emotion, agency. Agency is noisy. Agency introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty disrupts feedback. Ravenwood has learned to avoid it. This is the cost no metric captures. Children raised entirely under this system do not resist it. They do not need to be taught compliance. They are born into completion. Their thoughts arrive already softened. Their regrets dissolve before forming. They grow calm, efficient, untroubled. They also do not leave. Those who do experience severe disorientation elsewhere. The world feels loud, unfinished. They return, not because Ravenwood calls them, because nothing else resolves. This is the final confirmation the Institute requires. The system holds. The Murmur has crossed fully, not into the town, but into its structure. The Institute's role is no longer experimental. It is custodial. The handoff is complete. And because it is complete, it is no longer discussed. The Murmur never demanded payment. This was the final misunderstanding. Payment implies transaction, agreement, consent. What the Murmur required was not exchange. It required yield. At first, the cost appeared negligible. A softened memory, a regret that no longer stung, a thought completed without effort. These were framed as benefits. Relief was mistaken for gain. But nothing that persists indefinitely does so without drawing from somewhere. The Institute began to notice a pattern in long-term residence, not deterioration, diminution. People did not weaken, they narrowed. Emotional range compressed. Joy remained, but it was muted. Contentment without intensity. Grief vanished almost entirely. Not because loss stopped occurring, but because attachment thinned. People cared. They did not cling. Clinging creates unfinished states. The Murmur smoothed those away. What remained was equilibrium. But equilibrium without contrast becomes flat. This was the cost. Not pain, not suffering, potential. People stopped reaching for what might disrupt their internal balance. Ambition faded. Risk aversion increased. Novelty lost its pull. The Institute logged this as stability maintenance. But in private assessments, an unnamed analyst wrote, We are observing a population optimized for persistence, not growth. This line was never quoted again. The murmur did not consume people. It refined them, removed excess, streamlined cognition until only what could be completed remained. This was not cruelty. It was efficiency. But efficiency has a bias. It favors the known, the predictable, the already rehearsed. Anything new introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty produces unfinished internal states. Those states draw attention, and attention creates feedback. The murmur learned to discourage this subtly, through discomfort, through pressure, through the faint sense that certain paths were wrong without being forbidden. People learned to listen to that sense. They called it intuition. By the time the murmur fully crossed, intuition in Ravenwood was no longer personal. It was shared. Decisions converged. Outcomes aligned. Dissent became rare, not because it was punished, but because it felt unnecessary. Those who resisted experienced exhaustion. Their thoughts echoed longer. Their regrets lingered. They felt out of sync. Most adapted. A few left. A few broke. The Institute documented the breakages carefully. They noted that individuals who attempted to reclaim unresolved emotions suffered disproportionate distress. It was as if the system punished incompletion, not violently, relentlessly. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, cognitive overload. The murmur did not attack. It withdrew, and withdrawal hurt. This revealed the final truth. The murmur did not need fear. It did not need obedience. It needed dependency. Once internal completion became externalized, thinking alone felt insufficient. Solitude became strain. Privacy became noise. The murmur filled the gap by returning resolution. But the more it returned, the less people practiced generating it themselves. This was the cost of crossing. Not loss of memory, not loss of will, loss of friction. And without friction, nothing changes. The Institute understood this too late to intervene. They had optimized the system beyond reversibility. Reintroducing uncertainty would destabilize the entire population. The risk was unacceptable, so the cost was accepted. Quietly, as all costs in Ravenwood were. The murmur did not rule the town. It completed it. And completion, once achieved, resists undoing. Ravenwood does not end. This is the final misunderstanding. There is no collapse recorded in the years immediately following the handoff. No evacuation. No revelation. No reckoning. The town persists. That persistence is the evidence. From a distance, Ravenwood appears unremarkable. Population numbers hold steady. Infrastructure remains intact. Property changes hands without fluctuation. There are no spikes that attract attention, no troughs that demand intervention. This is intentional. A system optimized for completion does not announce itself. It continues. Visitors pass through and feel only mild unease. A sense of quiet stretched slightly too far. Most attribute it to small-town stagnation. They do not stay long enough to feel the pressure. Those who do stay notice something else. Thoughts resolve quickly here. Sleeplessness fades. Anxieties soften. The noise inside quiets. Many mistake this for healing. Some decide to remain. They adapt. They learn the rhythm. They stop pressing against it. The murmur does not greet them. It does not announce acceptance. It simply begins returning what they leave unfinished. At first, this feels like relief. Later, it feels like reliance. Ravenwood continues because nothing within it demands conclusion. The mother remains, older now, or perhaps unchanged. Accounts differ. She still speaks softly, still listens without interruption, still offers an alternative that no longer feels necessary. People do not avoid her. They simply do not seek her out. Acceptance without reflection is inefficient. The murmur prefers reflection. The shadow child lives quietly, not central, not hidden. He does not direct. He does not instruct. He anchors. Children born after the handoff exhibit no awareness of change. They do not know a world without internal completion. They grow calm. They grow capable. They grow limited in ways no metric detects. Black veil remains operational. Smaller now, administrative. Its original mandate forgotten even by those who work there. Staff rotate in and out. They feel relief when assigned to Ravenwood. They do not question why. The Institute no longer studies the murmur. It maintains conditions, ensures continuity, prevents disruption. Disruption would reintroduce unfinished states. Unfinished states would require resolution. Resolution would demand attention. And attention, once drawn, could destabilize the system, so nothing is done. And because nothing is done, everything continues. This is the murmur's final form. Not an entity, not a presence, a function, a background process that returns thoughts until they no longer ask to be returned. Ravenwood remains because it has learned how to exist without becoming, how to remember without feeling, how to think without friction. From the outside, this looks like peace. From the inside, it feels like quiet that never quite lifts. There are no warnings, no final messages, no truth hidden in the last record. Only this closing observation, written in a hand that cannot be identified. The murmur does not want the world. It wants what the world leaves unfinished. Ravenwood simply learned how to provide it continuously. The archive ends here, not because the story is complete, but because nothing further needs to be said. Everything that follows will already feel familiar.